And all right, 7. I'm going to go ahead and start. Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Farah Akbar, and I'm a doctoral student in the program of TESOL and Applied Linguistics at Teachers College, Columbia University. My colleague Ann, who is also a doctoral student at Northern Arizona University, will be co-hosting today's webinar with me. This webinar is organized by the Committee for Online Education and Outreach, and we would like to thank AAAL and the Executive Committee for their support and the opportunity to host this webinar. We are delighted by the strong interest shown by you, the AAAL community. Thank you. Please keep an eye out for additional webinars that will be offered this year. Today's event is divided into 2 parts. During the first part, we will hear from our invited guests about various issues pertaining to inequities in journal publishing and applied linguistics. As you are sure to have questions for them, we will devote the second half of the webinar to a discussion and Q&A. As you have noticed, the audio and video options for attendees have been disabled. We do, however, encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A chat box. It will be open during the entire webinar, so you can submit your questions at any time. The Q&A discussion will be moderated at the end by Anne and myself. So before introducing our speakers, we would like to recognize that the discussion on inequities in journal publishing is a vast one, and one that is relevant to a growing number of scholars in applied linguistics. A whole field of research has been devoted to this topic. For example, you can see the works, the numerous works of Dr. Mary Jane Curry and Dr. Teresa Lillis, who are leading experts. However, it is not very frequent to hear directly from multilingual scholars about their personal struggles and experiences with publishing in a language that is not their primary language. It is with that intention that we have put together today's webinar. So thank you again for joining us. With that, I would pass the floor to Anne to introduce our panelists. Anne.
Yeah, thank you, Farah. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists. We will first hear from Dr. Miyuki Sasaki, who is a professor at the Faculty of Education and Integrated Arts and Sciences at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. She currently serves on the editorial boards of Language Testing and Journal of Second Language Writing. She has been doing research and current research interests include the longitudinal development of first and second language writing ability and strategy use and environmental effects on second language learning motivation. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Sasaki. Next, we will hear from Dr. Suresh Kanagaraja, who is currently an Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Applied Linguistics, English, and Asian Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. His research covers World Englishes, translingualism, and social and political issues in language education. He served as editor of TESOL Quarterly from 2005 to 2009, and his 2013 book, Translingual Practice, Global Englishes and Cosmopolitan Relations, received a number of awards, including AAAL's Best Book Award in 2016. So we are very pleased that Dr. Kanagaraja is here today. And then closing our lineup is Dr. Naoko Taguchi, who is a professor in the Department of English at Northern Arizona University. Her primary research area is pragmatics in SLA, and she co-authored Second Language Pragmatics from Theory to Research 2018, which was the finalist of the AAAL Outstanding Book Award 2020. She's now also the co-editor of the journal Applied Pragmatics. And a big thank to Dr. Taguchi for agreeing to be here with us. And Yeah, with further ado, I will now pass the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Miyuki Sasaki, and the title of her presentation is A Non-Deficit View of Multilingual Researchers, Transdisciplinary Hopes. Can you please share your screen and talk to us? Yeah,
Thank you,
thank
Anne.
you.
Share the screen. Um, okay, thank you, Anne. Hello from Japan, everybody. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to take part in the webinar. The title of my talk is A Non-Deficit View of Multilingual Researchers, Transdisciplinary Hopes. I took the subtitle Transdisciplinary Hopes from Ortega 2018, and I'll say a bit more about this source at the end of my talk. In this presentation, I'll talk about three things in 8 minutes. First, I'll talk about the non-deficit view of journal publishing. Then I'll briefly talk about a project I've recently been involved with as an example of that view. And I'll conclude with some final words about why I put transdisciplinary hopes as the subtitle of my talk. I live in Japan, one of the peripheries of mainstream academic applied linguistics. If getting published in top-tier journal is the only norm for success as a researcher, the distance from mainstream academia could be an obstacle, and I used to think that way. I call it a deficit view of publishing because just like the deficit view of L2 acquisition, where L2 learners are assessed only in terms of how far they still are from the native speaker norm, we as researchers assess ourselves and our work only in terms of how far we still are from the mainstream and from publishing in mainstream top-tier journals. But I've come to realize that this is not the only way to view myself and my work. Instead, I've come to regard myself as a multilingual researcher whose priority is to use her knowledge most effectively, not where her studies may be published. I owe these ideas to two economists I've worked with over the past 6 years, and I'd like to share these experiences with you in this talk. As an example, I'll talk about one of the projects I co-authored with them. The research question was, what impacts does an online English learning program have on Japanese EFL high school students when it is provided outside the classroom on a self-selection basis over 5 months? This online English learning program offered interactive lessons that lasted 25 minutes. It was individualized and self-paced. In the program, students can choose a lesson from a wide range of materials available from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. every day with a well-trained Filipino teacher. At that time, it was new to many people in Japan. Our participants were 321 Japanese high school students. They were in grade 10. We randomly divided them into an experimental group and a control group. They were recommended to use the program at least 3 times a week, but they were also told that their participation wouldn't affect their grades, so its use was totally up to them. We used a commercial speaking test called Versant to measure their English listening and speaking ability, and the 22-item questionnaire to measure their international posture, which consists of 4 subcategories adapted from Yashima 2002. The program started in July 2015, and we observed both groups over 5 months. Before and after the program, we measure the students' listening and speaking ability as well as their degree of international posture. Results showed, surprise, the program had no impact on the students' listening and speaking ability. This may be because although 81% of the students used the program at least once over the 5 months, only about 8% of the students used the program in each of these 5 months. Many students might have been reluctant to use it because it wouldn't affect their grades. Interestingly, however, their international posture, especially their scores on interest in foreign affairs and an international vocation, increased significantly over the 5 months. We speculated that the student may have been influenced by seeing so many Filipino teachers using English professionally, even if they didn't use the program very often. But the most interesting thing for me was how the two economists chose the journal they would send this paper to. They said, let's find a journal whose audience will find our results most useful. For them, the key factor in publishing was not the prestige of the journal, but how effectively they could reach people who would use the results. This was an eye-opening experience for me. In the end, we chose Asian Development Review, published by MIT Press. We based our decision on the idea that many people in the educational policy field in Asia might consider introducing such an online program. For example, they might want to introduce it for students in non-urban areas so that these students could have access to more frequent and individualized speaking practice in English. We also posted a short version of our paper on the website of the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, which had commissioned the study. When it was first uploaded, the post attracted 2,000 reviews in a single day. I was happily surprised that there seemed to be so much interest in our results. I don't think any of my papers have attracted so many readers before. I learned that producing useful knowledge derived directly from the fact that I'm located in Japan, a periphery of applied linguistics, is rewarding and can make me happy as a researcher, even if it's not published in a top-tier journal in applied linguistics. Now, I also think that this non-deficit view of publishing has a potential to make many researchers' lives more rewarding, because we all have multiple ways to use our knowledge effectively, not just a single norm as our ultimate goal. And these multiple ways can include working with people in other disciplines. So I'd like to conclude this talk by saying that finding ways to generate useful knowledge about multilingualism, not constrained by the deficit view that publishing in top-tier applied linguistics journal is the only ultimate goal can make the lives not only of multilingual researchers, but also of all researchers more meaningful and rewarding. But please note that I'm not suggesting that publishing in a top-tier journal is not worthwhile, but that it is not the only goal. In Ortega 2018, the phrase transdisciplinary hopes is used to advocate applied linguists working with people in other disciplines to pursue issues like social justice. But I'd like to borrow this phrase here to promote cases like the example I just showed. Such transdisciplinary work has a possibility of making not only multilingual researchers like me, but also any researchers in applied linguistics feel less marginalized and more empowered. Thank you for your attention. These are the references for my talk. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sasaki, for a very engaging presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Suresh Kanagaraja, who will be talking about his experiences, and the title of his presentation is Access to Resources in Shaping Publishability. Please welcome Dr. Kanagaraja.
Thank you. Let me see if I can project my PowerPoint.
Yes, we see it.
So when we ask for questions from participants, the moderators sent us the questions, and there were a lot on language and being a non-native speaker of English. So I want to broaden the conversation. Language is important, but there are also a lot of other conventions and requirements And I learned this the hard way. I came to the United States in the 90s for my PhD. And then when I went back to Sri Lanka to teach, I said, I know native speaker varieties of English. I don't speak it, but at least I know what they talk about in terms of that. I know the conventions of publishing. And I now have all my data from my dissertation. I'm going to publish from Sri Lanka. I soon realized that language was not the issue. There are a lot of other requirements. For example, our libraries were not well stocked with the latest publications, nor the widest range of publications. So every time I and a lot of my colleagues from Sri Lanka sent something for a journal in the United States, they would say, this is inappropriately framed. You're not entering into our conversation in a relevant way. We didn't know the conversation because we didn't have the latest books. So those are the type of issues I'm discussing in terms of access to resources, which is a problem for scholars from the global South. But they're equally a problem for racialized, minoritized scholars in the US, or if you're teaching in a community college, not an R1 institution, you're going to be affected in terms of resources. So when I came back to the United States to teach after a few years, this is one of the first books I published, Geopolitics of Academic Writing, published by University of Pittsburgh Press 2002. And because of the short time I have, I'm just going to pick up a couple of examples, a couple of issues that I discuss in terms of my colleagues in Sri Lanka and myself. And we can, of course, expand things as we go along. So before I begin, I just want to point out some dilemmas scholars in the periphery face. One of them is, we have all heard of publish or perish. It's a high stakes activity. But for a lot of other scholars, this is not very important. For example, in Sri Lanka, we were expected to teach more rather than publish. We were expected to contribute to the community more by helping in language planning kind of issues, language policy issues. So we were not given time to publish a lot. And now how that affects is if you don't publish a lot, frequently, intensely, you're also going to be left out of some of the academic conversations. So if some of my colleagues publish once in 5 years, once in 10 years, they're going to be out of date. But there's a bigger problem of not being actively involved in publishing. There are a lot of conventions you would get to know only if you actively publish. So consider, for example, how to interpret the editor's decision letter. There are a lot of subtle, very nuanced points the decision letter and the reviewers' comments might make, which would involve interpreting and reading carefully between the lines. A lot of people who are in publishing actively might know how to interpret them, but the first time I tried to publish, the editors wrote back, "Congratulations on coming so close to getting published at a very at this early stage of your career." I thought that's bad news. But after many months, when I showed it to my American advisor, he said, that's not bad news. Actually, at the end, they say you can revise and publish, or revise and resubmit. But I missed that because I didn't know how to interpret it. So I want to just illustrate 3 kinds of publishing conventions very broadly that we all need to be aware of. The first I call non-discursive requirements because this has nothing to do with language. This has a lot to do with practices. So I already talked to you about having latest research publications, but look at the second one. If you are not familiar with the range of journals in a field, you might not make a good decision on where to send it. Miyuki, of course, gave a good example of how people chose the journal carefully. But in our case in Sri Lanka, we sometimes sent papers to the wrong journals because we didn't know a lot about them. So once I did a critical discourse analysis of some newspaper articles in Sri Lanka, and unfortunately, I sent it to a journal on cognition and language. That was not the title, but that was in the guidelines which I didn't have access to. Clear reject. So after that, I told my colleagues, our papers are not bad papers. They're good papers. for the bad journals, or rather the wrong journals. So this happens to a lot of us. I will skip some of the other points. Communication is important. Communication resources are important. A lot of people would send you a copy edited version and say, write back in 2 days. And a lot of people who don't have the access to that kind of communication resources may not be able to do that. Look at the final point. You need a lot of time and space to engage in publishing. But if you're in a university where you have a lot of teaching to do or community work to do, you won't be able to engage in publishing with that level of intensity, right? So even time and space matters. Let me move on to the second type of broad convention. I call it para RA. RA, as a lot of people in publishing know, stands for research articles. That's the key genre, the high stakes genre of academic publishing, not the book chapter. But beyond the research article, there are certain other genres that we don't recognize. Think about the cover letter, for example. How do you write the cover letter? A lot of my colleagues, many of them thought we have to be very objective and neutral. So they just wrote one sentence. Dear editor, I am hereby attaching my paper on this. Thank you for your consideration. There are others who wrote like 5 pages. If you publish this article, it'll change the field. It shall change humanity. They were trying to kind of lobby for the paper. So Swales, who has done a lot of research on publishing and genres like this, calls them occluded genres because he says, we don't recognize them as genres, but they are genres. There are conventions. And then he goes on to say, how we come off in these cover letters, etc., still affects publishing. We might say publishing is impersonal. It shouldn't, but it does. So here's an experiment that was done by some psychologists in 1982. They took 12 articles that were already published in a psychology journal, changed the cover letter, and used university names that were obscure and unknown. That's, I quote from them, obscure places. Not Harvard, but Montgomery Community College or something like that. And what they found was eventually only 2 of those articles were recommended for publication, 10 were declined. Can you see? So in Sri Lanka, our letters were written, institutional letters were in bad quality paper, very light. The print was very bad. We don't know how those things affect our chances of getting published. So here are some of these occluded genres. I already talked about cover letter, but and also the referee's letter, referee's comments. And something that's being said now is that editors don't get a lot of time to respond to authors. So the editorial decision letters are extremely short and to the point. Some people just say, dear author, I'm attaching the reviews of for your paper. This paper is rejected. Now, about 10 years ago, the editors engaged with the reviewer comments, gave you guidelines, what to do about the revision, etc. So now we don't get those things, and that's affecting a lot of periphery scholars in terms of how to take up these comments. So cover letter has been studied by John Swales, and what he says is the practices we adopted in Sri Lanka, either the single sentence neutral letter or 5-page lobbying, which Swales here calls pushy, being pushy. He says, don't do that. You do have to say a few other things, like if the paper is not obviously relevant for the journal, show the relevance, say whether the paper was delivered anywhere as a talk or was it presented anywhere else. So there are a few things we do have to say, and at the time, we didn't know how to write a cover letter. So these occluded genres are equally important as the research article. So let's now come to the meat of the journal publication, which we all think is the research article. But we might easily forget there are a lot of other genres also in a research journal. So sometimes we wrote think pieces or reflective essays, just a theoretical topic like contrastive rhetoric, pros and cons. How does it relate to writers in Sri Lanka? No data, no research. TESOL Quarterly would send it back even without reviewing it. because that journal's guidelines say this is about teaching, but research about teaching. So if you don't look at that guideline carefully, a reflective essay may not be published. On the other hand, there is a space for that. So TESOL Quarterly, MLJ, and a lot of other journals have a forum section, except that the forum is 3,400 words, not 8,000 words. So we might decide to send a reflective essay to the forum, but it has to be shorter. So let's come to the research article. This has been studied a lot, and a lot of people talk about it as the introduction, methods, results, discussion, genre, IMRD. So I'll just quickly go to the section that has been most studied, which is the introduction section. So John Swales calls this the CARS model, creating a research space model. And it's very simple, very common sense, which is before you start your paper, establish the territory. Is this SLA? Is it the social side of language acquisition? Where does this belong? Is it task-based theory? Is it communicative language teaching? Then the second move, by reviewing the relevant literature, show a gap. Where do you see an entry point for your paper that's new? And the third move is show what you're doing in relation to this gap, which is almost like your thesis statement, right? But I want to show how these material resources affect genre conventions. That is, even access to resources have implications for the use of language and genre conventions. So think about the first and second move. In Sri Lanka, we couldn't do these moves very effectively because we didn't know the latest literature or the widest range of literature. So a lot of times, I told you earlier, a lot of journals would say, this paper is interesting, the study is interesting, but it is inappropriately framed. Or they would say, it's not clear what new thing you are saying with this study. So try to say it upfront. What are you trying to contribute? Now, there's a reason why we don't do it this way. We do in some of our research articles, at the very end of the paper, we say, this is what is new about my paper, right? So if you see the preferred structure in the West, in research journals here, it's very front-weighted. That's a term that Anna Maurinen used. That is, all the important key work happens in the beginning of the essay. Your argument, your thesis, what's important about your research, it's all upfront in the very beginning. We do it at the very end. Here's an ideological factor that comes into play. They do it this way, apparently in the United States, Europe, etc., because there's a lot of competition for publishing. Your promotion, your grants depend on this. In Sri Lanka and a lot of other periphery communities where we publish once in 5 years or once in 10 years, we are not competing with each other like that. It's not competition, it's not intense. So we are very relaxed. We say, I want to write today about communicative language teaching, blah, 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 data, data, data. And at the end, I use this paper to bring out this important point. The significance is at the very end. So as you can see, there's a reason, an ideological reason, and Anna Maurinen calls this structure marketing discourse. That is, it's like marketing your product, your research. You are showing what's really important about your product right there up front and say, buy me, read me, read me. So, but a lot of other countries don't do that. And in fact, Anna Maurinen says in Finland, they have an end-weighted structure. That's all the important work happens in the end. So I just wanted to conclude with this and suggest that beyond just worrying about the English we use, we should also take into account that there are a lot of other conventions that go into publishability, and also material resources are equally important as language competence. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Kanagaraja. Yeah, some of the things that you have just mentioned and never thought about, and really appreciate what we just heard. I'd like to pass the floor to our next speaker, Dr. Naoko Taguchi, and the title of her presentation is Inequalities in Journal Publishing, Ideal, Reality, and Suggestions. Please welcome Dr. Taguchi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this very valuable webinar, and I'm very happy to be one of the participants. So I will start my presentation. It's going to be very brief, but unlike Miyuki and Suresh's presentations, which are very sophisticated and scholarly, mine is going to be almost completely personal. And also my thoughts are random, not really coherent under the theme. And I just want to talk about what I go through day to day as a multilingual and non-native speaker of English. So my own personal experience. And I want to reflect on the ideal and the reality of the current situation around this discourse based on my own experience. So I will start with the ideal. And so as we all know, this ELF, English as a lingua franca, and intercultural communication have brought new norms in our discourse of English, users of English. And we have more non-native speakers of English than native speakers of English in the world. So native speaker authority and monolingual normality are seriously questioned. And we see these quotes, we see this in the quote by Theodor Hofer almost more than a decade ago, and being able to use a language like native speakers without the trace of the L1 is increasingly perceived unnecessary, unrealistic, and at least by some undesirable. And other scholars have expressed that non-native standard English use are not the errors, and they are resources for communicative effectiveness and linguistics creativity. So we have these insights coming out again and again, and really helped us to embrace this legitimate non-native speaker English. So this is an ideal, but reality doesn't really catch up with this ideal. And so I want to speak from my own experience. And so
I'm sorry, Dr. Taguchi, there's some sound maybe near your speaker. There's some sound.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for interrupting.
Is my,
Yes,
were you able to hear?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All
It's
right.
good now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, so ideal, I talked about this. And the reality, so based on my own experience, I feel that native speaker standard is still expected in many publications, but the standard is never defined. So, so I send my papers to the journal for review, and I often get comments from the reviewers saying that they can see that the paper is written by a non-native speaker of English, and because of the numerous errors, and they recommend proofreading the paper before submitting. Although I always have somebody proofread my paper, and I often pay those people to proofread my paper before I submit. But still, there is a trace of non-native speakerness in my writing. And so that's my experience. And I also think that in terms of this standard, the standard may not be just based on the correct usage, one native like standard English. And I feel that it could be part of, it could be in part based on the reviewer's personal preference and personal style. And to support this, I have a little experience I want to share with you. My most recent experience, I was invited to submit my paper to this edited volume titled Pragmatics in English as a Lingua Franca. So this was the title of this volume, and I contributed in my chapter. And the editor of this volume is a native speaker of English from Inner Circle. And I went through very extensive revision process, and many of the comments coming from the reviewer or editor was on the language. And I really appreciated the editor's patience going through the same draft again and again. and providing very meticulous corrections on the paper. And this is one of the examples. So you can see the original text I wrote and the edited version of the text. The original is the text I wrote, and the edited version is editor's feedback. And we can see the difference. And clearly, the second one, edited version is much better. It's much more concise and clear, and more sophisticated in style and writing. But I felt that my version is not particularly incorrect or wrong. And so that was my thought. And what I thought the most unusual with this experience is that, so this whole volume, the title is English as a lingua franca in pragmatics. And so the chapters in this volume are talking about the native speaker norm and native speaker standard is not relevant in judging non-native speakers' abilities. And my point in the chapter was exactly that. And so that was was in my thought. So given this experience I have now, I feel that there is a gap between the reality, ideal, and reality. So, so based on my experience, I want to conclude my presentation with several suggestions. And so those suggestions are very personal again, and also somewhat random, but I just jot down what I have in my mind. And I want to share what I have as suggestions. And one is that don't take the reviewers or editors' comments personally. So the term inequalities sort of imply unfairness, unfair practice. But I don't necessarily agree that the current practices are unfair. Because if you look at the journal publications, any journals, many of the papers are written by non-native speakers, although I'm just guessing based on the names and the affiliation and the countries, but many are written by non-native speakers. So what matters at the end is the study quality. So those papers which reflect good thinking and good study quality and generated new knowledge, advancing the field get published. So writing is maybe it's one of the components for publishable papers, but far more important thing is the study quality. And I also think that good writing, what is good writing? And my suggestion is to become a competent writer, not a native speaker writer. And in order to become a competent writer, what I do personally is to always keep my audience in mind while writing. So I tend to use many technical words and concepts, but then sometimes I put myself in the audience shoes and think about, do they actually understand it? Or do I have to give an example? Do I have to explain more? So I try to focus on clarity and the effectiveness of the communication so I can reduce the burden on the audience in understanding my text. And I think it's really a fundamental point in order to communicate your ideas to the public. And it's not just about grammar or lexical choice, it's about the effectiveness of the communication. And finally, I encourage particularly graduate students to ask your peers for support. And when I was a PhD student at Northern Arizona, we had a great community among students. We often swapped papers, and I asked my peers to proofread my papers, but also I helped them to with APA format, for example. So we collaborated and helped each other in producing quality writing. So this community of academic writers in the graduate school, I think that may be something which may be helpful for PhD students as they try to publish their papers. Okay, so this is all I have to say, and so I will, I'm stop sharing my slides here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taguchi. That was very interesting, especially the part where you mentioned the graduate students and PhD students. So thank you for not forgetting us. We have 20 minutes for questions, and I was going through the Q&A box here. I'm going to start from the top. This question is posed for the panel. It is, which way do you suggest to promote that top academic journals start appreciating multilingualism by allowing publications in other non-English languages, perhaps? Anyone can take that question. You're muted, Dr. Kanagaraja.
I wanted to just say that already in a lot of journals, they want the abstract translated into one or two other languages. It's a small beginning. So, at least a lot of people decide what to read based on the abstract because they are short of time. So it's a good start, and a lot of times recently, a lot of articles I've been getting help to translate them into other languages. Eventually, it's going to be an issue of marketability and economics about how whether journals feel they can employ copy editors for multiple languages, for example, how much money it would cost, whether there is a market as big as that in English in order to sell a journal in my language, Tamil, which is an ancient and very old language, but it might go against a lot of other smaller dialects. But let me just give a good news. Maybe digital technology might help because it's possible to have a paper edition in one language and digital versions in other languages. A lot of journals are also providing space to post additional material related to the article on their website. So I have, in some cases, given additional data like video data or longer transcripts as a part for the website of the journal. So that might be a more promising way to go. Again, there are inequalities. Why should somebody read it on paper and all the others go on to the website? And a lot of countries, especially countries that matter, poorer countries, may not have fast internet and the resources to read something on the web all the time. But yeah, at least I'm glad this conversation is starting.
Right. Thank you. This next question is directed at Dr. Taguchi. There's some discussion going on in the chat box related to the examples that you shared, the original and the edited version of your work. First of all, thank you for sharing that. We hardly see such examples. So the question here is, Dr. Naoko, the contradiction you pointed out is very clear. Do you feel empowered to challenge an editor who is making such revisions to your texts? Panelists who are editors, like Dr. Kanagaraja and also Dr. Sasaki, how is non-standard or personal style of authors handled? Please.
So as I said, I was grateful for this editor's commitment and patience, and particularly like 5 rounds of edits like this. So I mean, I was really appreciative. So I didn't challenge, and because it doesn't really contradict with what I want to say. And so in a way, he was helping me to clarify meaning. And so at least from his point of view, maybe it wasn't clear. And so he gave me suggestions. So the editor, he jotted down those comments and edited my papers, but he always said, these are my suggestions. And so you don't have to feel, forced to take those suggestions. And so it wasn't like, mandatory kind of revisions. And since I took them like a way to help or improve my writing in terms of quality, and I didn't take them personally in a way. So I didn't challenge. But if the editor pointed out something in a way to obscure my intention or meaning, I would have challenged.
Right. Thank you.
Well,
Yes.
if you wanted to, I think some people said, people who have edited, what do you do? One of the things I've appreciated is when authors fight back. Let's use a less provocative term, negotiate. And I am a firm believer in negotiation. That is, at least the negotiation of an author shows that they have a intention behind what they are doing. They care about what they're doing. A lot of times, copy editing is made to appear like it's just a mechanical, impersonal process. That's just a way to do. But it is not, because a lot of time there are implications for voice, ideology, identity. So I suggest, in this case, it was clear that Naoko appreciated the change, but there might be other cases where some people say, it's very important for my paper that I maintain that formulation, that syntactic formulation, or it's important for my voice that I do it this way. Maybe one step ahead of the negotiation process might be, can we give some clues in the paper that this formulation is important, in the sense, the way the paragraph is written, that this particular sentence structure or phrasing is important. So if they get the message, they will not touch it. But on the other hand, if there is a misunderstanding or a lack of appreciation for what you're doing, I suggest, I think what they say is, after your paper has gone through a review process, you have space for a give and take, for writing to the editor or the editorial office. Not before, but once your paper is in the review process. So there are some spaces to talk back.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to add.
Yes. Yes, please.
It's important for multilingual writers to know that kind of thing can be negotiable. I didn't know, like, I've never negotiated in the past, and now I feel like I should have. So I would have got more publication. But I didn't know such a thing, and I think we should know that, and I hope Suresh work would be known to more people. Yeah, so we, as multilingual writer, we will know that kind of thing can be negotiable, so we could negotiate. Otherwise, we just give up at the point, like, if we assume like that kind of thing cannot be negotiated, we just give up, and that's really bad. Thank you, Suresh, for sharing that.
So the list of questions on my screen has it's all jumbled up now, because there's an upvote to questions. So the one with the most votes is on top, and I'm going to read that question now. When do we know the paper is good enough to be sent to a journal for review? Usually we only see the final drafts of research articles, but never see the first drafts. As a non-native speaker, I always feel so timid in sending in the articles. Could you share your insight, please? Thank you. So when do you know that your paper is ready to be published?
I guess there are issues related. I guess the person who wrote it is concerned about language issues, but there are also research issues. So, we need to keep all of those in mind. There are again multiple issues here. One is we have all heard of the imposter syndrome. We all feel inadequate. We all feel we all lack confidence sometimes. So that's one issue. But maybe one of the things that came in both Miyuki's and Naoko's talk was collaboration and how you work with people. So that can help us, because the person who reads your paper, maybe a fellow graduate student, the advisor, we should, thinking about graduate students, also colleagues, if they read it and they share their opinion on the content as well as the readiness of the paper, that might give us confidence because we know. So, but I know a lot of us, I guess a lot of questions sometimes go on the assumption, I am the single lone writer here, struggling against the publishing world. But there is something real about it, that is, it's hard to get people to read our papers and comment on them because nobody has time. But that's not publishing. Publishing, is again picking up one of John Swales's phrases. Publishing is a shaped activity. That's one of his direct quotations. That means there's a lot of shaping going on, multiple people, a lot of different processes involved. It's not me sending something to the editor and next day seeing it on print. So if we can get people to read it, and we should never send something without having it read by colleagues, advisors, peers. That might help us. Not only to tell us, assess the content of the paper, but also comment on language, to say which syntax might be preferable here, which is unclear, which kind of formulation would be more coherent and clear. So we can get a lot of that kind of help with collaboration from people.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yes.
One thing I want to add to what Suresh said was like, the tip is you shouldn't be a perfectionist, because if you wait until your paper becomes perfect, that time will never come. And so if you think your paper is okay, acceptable, and if you send it to your colleagues, and if they think they have okay quality, maybe send it to a journal. And if your reviewers don't like it, you can revise it based on the reviews. So just don't wait until it becomes perfect, because the perfect paper will never come. That's my tip.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a valuable insight. There's a question. I'm going back to the chat box here, not the Q&A, but the other one. And there's a question here by Dr. Ortega for Dr. Sasaki. How can we become empowered and overcome deficit views in our thinking about where to publish for useful knowledge, even if we do not collaborate with researchers from other fields?
Okay. I think if I send a paper to a journal as a solo author, and if the paper gets published and known to other people, and if my audience will find, if my audience find the quality and the content of the paper very, very helpful and useful, I would feel really empowered, no matter where the paper is published. So I really don't feel like to maybe whether or not the journal is top tiered, but if I hear the audience voice that if they say, Miyuki, the results of your paper really are very, very helpful, I would feel really empowered. I want to hear other people's opinion too. What do you think?
Yes. What do you think, Dr. Taguchi, if I may?
I'm sorry, about the deficit, how to overcome deficit view. Yeah.
Right.
So actually Miyuki's presentation was very eye-opening, like a selection of the journals, because we tend to be very much go towards the top tier journals with high impact factor. But I think the idea that we need to reach as many audience as possible and who are interested in the particular work you produced. So I think it's an audience-based perspective on the selection of the journal. I think it's really important. So I'm kind of thinking, so what is like really the deficit we are talking here? I mean, so deficit view as non-native speaker of English, or deficit view as people who can't publish, and I think there are many views towards deficit. But as I said in my presentation, if we look at the publications in the journals, many people from many different countries actually publish. And so I think I do believe that the study quality, I think it's a fundamental. And one other thing, maybe like how to overcome deficit view is when I'm writing papers, I always think about the reviewers, what they would say in particular section. And okay, so there is a problem here. They might point this out. They might point out and ask for more clarifications. So like thinking about what other people might think about the piece I produce. I think that thinking helps me to gain confidence in my writing. Mm.
Yeah, I guess if you draw an analogy from applied linguistics, the deficit view of language is in relation to a norm of some sort. So unfortunately, the norm that we are all fighting against is top tier journals, high impact factor, all of which contribute to our tenure and promotion, getting a job, etc. But what Miyuki showed is multilingualism as a resource, or in the sense that diversity is a resource. That's a kind of alternative way. But let me kind of build upon that by saying we all have to be multi-genre writers. Just writing only data-driven articles for double-blind review is only one genre, and it does matter. And as all of us have said, we perish without publishing a paper or two like that. But on the other hand, what do you value about your writing? If it is, in Miyuki's case, it was the audience, the target audience. They wanted that article to be read by particular types of scholars. So we expanded a little bit. There are certain types of knowledge that don't have much value read in the United States, but in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. There are certain types of knowledge that are more relevant for Africa rather than America. So we might have to then think about regional journals, pedagogical journals, and somebody asked in the question also about podcasts and blogs. So that's also part of the multi-genre approach. So I would say if we really care about writing, we shouldn't stop with data-driven articles. We should exercise our talents, our knowledge in as diverse a range of genres as we can, because certain types of articles are better in certain other places. So I would say that certain types of ideas or research are better as a podcast rather than as a article in a top-tier journal.
Yeah, I agree with Suresh. I just saw the one question from the audience saying that we first decide which journal we should send that paper to before we even conduct the research. But for the particular case I did with the economists, we decide which journal we should send the paper to after we conducted the research. And we did a survey, like which journal would have an audience that would appreciate our results most. And we looked at the purpose statement of each journal, and we decided on the particular journal. And that was really eye-opening to me. And I've never done that kind of process when I want to get my paper published. And that was, I think I'd like to share part of my time in the future for doing that kind of study.
Yeah. That's a great tip. Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you. I'm moving on to the next question. This is in relation to the different type of genre that Dr. Kanagaraja also mentioned in his talk. So advanced graduate students and novice scholars are increasingly invited to review manuscripts. Do you have any suggestions for them to approach evaluating a manuscript and writing a review? And I would add, as non-native graduate students, non-native English-speaking graduate students, what would you advise them?
So my advice is talk to the advisor and maybe work with advisor for the first a few reviews. And I have done that in my previous institution at Carnegie Mellon University. I worked with a PhD students. So when I get a request to review the papers, and if the papers are somewhere in my students' research area, we reviewed jointly. And I did inform my editor that I'm including my PhD students to review this paper. And I make sure that, I go review, check the reviews done by my PhD students. And I think that's my suggestion I have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to add to that, I've thought of it as a mentoring exercise. It's a great mentoring exercise to talk as an advisor and a graduate student. What goes into it? What's this genre? And how is it written? So I second Naoko's idea.
Great, thank you. Next question. It's already 8. Is it okay if we go a little over time? This is a very engaging discussion. And we have around 900 participants online. So thank you, everybody. All right, next question is about, as a journal editor, I've had a few reviewers who took it upon themselves to copy, edit, with more questions coming up, the screen starts moving. Okay, as a journal editor, I've had a few reviewers who took it upon themselves to copy edit manuscripts I asked them to review, rather than comment on the quality of the study. What advice do you have for editors to guide reviewers so that they do not copy edit or evaluate solely based on surface level language features?
This is an answer that also relates to a question a lot of people have about non-native varieties of English. When I was editing TESOL quarterly, together with the editorial board, we gave clear guidelines for the reviewers. And one of the things we said is, please keep in mind these submissions come from around the world with people who use different varieties of Englishes, and therefore be cautious when you make comments about people's grammar. So, because there are a lot of cases, insulting comments by reviewers who forget that they are not the only speakers of English. So along those lines, it might be possible to also give some guidelines to reviewers. Most journals do, except that I guess in this case, they went even beyond the guidelines to do something on their own. But let me just quickly tell you something that an editor did to me once when I was publishing from Sri Lanka. This editor cut out certain sections of the review because later I found she found them insulting. So I think editors have this is actually, I can tell you the name because she'll be proud of this, Sandra Silberstein of TESOL Quarterly, when she was editing it. She just took out, through a scissor, that was the time of paper and not digital. So I found that half the review was missing. So later when I became good friends with her, she told me, So I think editors have the authority to kind of leave out a review also if you want. I mean, not leave out, I guess reviewers may be angry, but maybe present it in a different format, just give the main points as part of the editor's letter rather than sending the copy edited version. But I remember I mentioned that there are all these para, RA genres, and I did mention the difference between copy editing, revising, etc. We kind of get it mixed up. Authors do that also. When we should be revising, we copy edit. And when we are asked to copy edit, we make major changes, which the journal doesn't allow. So we need to kind of know what's expected at what point.
Would you like to add anything, Dr. Sasaki or Taguchi? I can move on to the next question. Okay, so this is going to be my last question, and to the panel. It speaks to the roles and responsibilities of organizations like the AAAL in supporting multilingual scholars in their publication struggles, and particularly those in even less resourced and connected contexts. How can organizations like AAAL support such multilingual scholars?
I want the AAAL to advocate open source system of the journal, because from the like a consumer side of journals, like I used to work for a university whose library only subscribes to TESOL Quarterly only, not any other major journals in applied linguistics. And it was very, very hard for me to do literature reviews. And I think a lot of researchers in outside, like in the peripheral countries, they have this kind of problem. They don't even get access to the papers published in top tier journals or main academic journals, and unless they are exposed to the content of these papers, it's very hard for them to even write papers like that, right? So I really hope they have like they would advocate open source system of journals so that we will have more opportunities to get exposed to good quality studies in the field. Yes, that's
Most associations have guidelines, statements on best practices for mentoring graduate students, ethics related to research. I think we should add the challenges for periphery and minority scholars as part of that. So here's one. All scholars, all professors who are members of AAAL should not just produce PhDs of students from other countries, but continue to have contact with them and guide them in their publishing. So what happens with all of us is we produce PhDs of students and we make money out of it. Our universities depend on international students. And then we forget about them. You got your PhD, go back. So somebody commented that this practice leads to actually creating a market for our own work rather than making these periphery scholars knowledge creators in their own account. Can you see what happens? We get them to our universities, we teach them our terms, terminologies, so that they can go back to their country, buy our book, and understand what we are publishing here. And they don't have possibilities of publishing themselves. So can we think of PhDs, PhD education, graduate education as not stopping with producing a PhD, but continuing into the professionalization of this graduate student, which would include things that Miyuki said also. That is, you might have to send them a paper. You might have to email them a PDF of a recent publication because they haven't heard about that. You might have to co-author a paper with them. So that's a kind of a very personal kind of solution, in the sense membership of AAAL, who are all professors, many of them in good universities, might think of their work as not stopping with producing a PhD to be sent outside.
I really echo Suresh's ideas and also like professional development and continuing education. And so what I want to see in AAAL is maybe building communities of multilingual writers, and including both native and non-native speakers, and who have a common interest in improving writing, for example, and exchanging ideas about how to write in academic manner. And so building communities for students to exchange papers, read each other's papers and comment on them, I think that would be a great resource for graduate students, and also something I want to see growing more at AAAL.
Thank you. This was such an enriching and interesting discussion. Thank you so much. With that, we would like to thank our esteemed speakers, Dr. Sasaki, Dr. Taguchi, and Dr. Kanagaraja, for their time and for the wonderful discussion. Thank you to the participants for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. We also thank the community for submitting their questions beforehand. Look out for our next webinars, and we hope to see you at the annual conference in March. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, evening, wherever you are. Thank you. Yay, thank you.
I can just leave.
Yes, Dr.